Company wins funding to make medicine in space. The company has already designed a system which can develop and manufacture vaccines and gene therapies faster than most traditional methods. Now it will use the funding to adapt the system so that it works in space. It'll have to cope with the pressures and heat of leaving Earth in a rocket, says Mr. Vellacott, and of course in microgravity, liquids float, so we'll have to come up with a way of containing them. But Biologic Technologies believes its system can produce more than medicines. It also has the potential to make food and raw materials from basic biological ingredients. It's really difficult on Earth to study the effects of aging because it takes so long, but in space our cells age faster, and so this kind of research can be done quicker up there and potentially speed up new treatments, he says. Kamala Harris's historic presidential bid cements rapid ascent in Democratic politics. Kamala Harris has already made history as the first woman, the first black person, and the first person of South Asian descent to serve as Vice President of the United States. If she formally secures the Democratic presidential nomination and triumphs over former President Donald Trump in the November election, she would shatter the highest glass ceiling in all of American life. Harris marshaled overwhelming support from many party officials and raised $50 million after President Joe Biden abruptly withdrew from the race and endorsed her Sunday. But her quick ascent to the pinnacle of Democratic politics was not a foregone conclusion. In recent years, Harris has struggled to define herself on the national stage and drawn intense scrutiny from Republicans. The dramatically altered presidential race gives Harris, 59, a high-stakes opportunity to reintroduce herself to the country. The story she might tell is one of fierce ambition and a meteoric rise through the nation's corridors of power. How Kamala Harris's presidential campaign is rapidly taking shape. Washington, Vice President Kamala Harris and her allies quickly leaped into action Sunday, spending hours calling Democratic leaders, donors, and officials who may end up on the shortlist to become her running mate. Her most ardent supporters, many of them black women, held organizing calls Sunday night to solicit donations, recruit volunteers, and I pray. And major liberal donors began talking about how to reactivate party coffers that had been nearly frozen amid the uncertainty over President Joe Biden's future. The next weeks could be the most critical for Harris, not just to unify her party and gather the support needed to officially lock in the nomination, but also to raise enough cash to power a campaign and map out a path to beating former President Donald Trump in November. It will also be a crucial moment to define herself to American voters, as her Republican opponents ramp up attacks against her. House committee skewers Secret Service director for not answering major questions on Trump assassination attempt. Secret Service Director Kimberly Cheadle was skewered by a visibly frustrated House Oversight Committee on Monday after she said she took responsibility for security failures that led to the attempted assassination of former President Donald Trump but sidestepped several major questions. Cheadle, who was subpoenaed to testify, did not provide clear answers when committee members asked about whether the Secret Service had secured the building the gunman fired from and how he gained access to the roof. "I'm not going to get into specifics of the day," she said, citing an ongoing investigation. "There was a plan in place to provide overwatch, and we are still looking into responsibilities." It prompted committee members from both parties to tell her to resign over her incompetence, her lame excuses, and her lack of answers to what they called basic questions. As Biden dug in on continuing his campaign, Nancy Pelosi kept the pressure on. Washington, former Speaker Nancy Pelosi stepped down from her powerful perch leading House Democrats nearly a year and a half ago. But behind the scenes, sources say, Pelosi, a Democrat from San Francisco, played a critical role in delicately nudging President Joe Biden to the exits. Although Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Pelosi's protege, House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, both of New York, also told Biden about Democrats' concerns about him continuing his campaign, three sources told NBC News that any time the issue of his dropping out began to die down and lose momentum, they viewed Pelosi as the one fanning the flames. Unlike Schumer and Jeffries, Pelosi is no longer on the Democratic leadership team and could afford to be more front and center in the effort to push Biden out after his disastrous debate performance last month. Trump appeals civil fraud judgment against his company in New York case. Lawyers for Donald Trump on Monday appealed a civil fraud judgment from February that found the former president and his company liable for business fraud. The 95-page appeal, filed in the New York Supreme Court Appellate Division, accuses State Attorney General Letitia James of an unauthorized, unprecedented power grab and says several loans cited by prosecutors should not have been considered in the case. It also argues that James seeks to unwind and penalize complex, highly successful transactions between appellants and sophisticated Wall Street banks that left all parties deeply satisfied and had no impact on the public interest. Manhattan Judge Arthur Engoron oversaw the civil business fraud trial and ordered Trump and the Trump Organization to pay a $354 million penalty. The judgment, which was at $464 million as of late February, continues to accrue interest. Vance says he's annoyed he won't have the chance to debate Harris. Middletown, Ohio, Senator J.D. Vance was not happy when President Joe Biden ended his re-election campaign, throwing the Democratic Party's ticket into turmoil and robbing him of a moment he was looking forward to, debating Vice President Kamala Harris. "I was told I was going to debate Kamala Harris," Vance said here Monday during his first solo event as former President Donald Trump's running mate. "And now President Trump is going to get to debate her? I'm kind of pissed off about that, if I'm being honest with you." The event, held at the high school Vance graduated from in 2003, came a day after Biden dropped out of the presidential race. Biden, who was under pressure to step aside amid questions about his fitness for office and ability to run a winning campaign, endorsed Harris to replace him as the Democratic nominee. Much of the party's establishment has followed suit, a development that Vance cast in his remarks as an affront to democracy. Some black voters disappointed by Biden's exit but excited for Kamala Harris. At brunch Sunday near Seattle, April Berg and her girlfriend's cell phones simultaneously began to ping. "We thought somebody had died," she said. Rather, word had spread that President Joe Biden had pulled out of the presidential race. Moments later, he endorsed Vice President Kamala Harris to succeed him as the Democratic nominee. Berg and her friend's normal 90-minute gathering lasted almost 4 hours. "It generated so much spicy conversation," said Berg, who was black, a Democrat, and a Washington State House representative. Berg and millions of black voters were pivotal to Biden's victory in 2020, especially in key swing states like Georgia. In his 2020 victory speech, Biden thanked black voters and said he would do right by them. Throughout his presidency, Biden has touted his administration's accomplishments, like reducing child poverty, which particularly affects black families, and appointing Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson to the Supreme Court. Trump world has been preparing to run against Kamala Harris for weeks. Trump's political team has been preparing to run against Harris for weeks, something it got one step closer to today after Biden said he is dropping out of the race. "We are pretty excited about the fact that he endorsed Kamala," said Richard Grenell, a former U.S. ambassador to Germany and Trump's acting director of national intelligence. "As we know in California, she has never been vetted. Kamala Harris is a product of this whole system. She's very far left, unvetted and untested. There is no guarantee Harris will replace Biden as the Democratic nominee, but in the hours after Biden announced he was getting out of the race, he and several other key Democrats, including potential rivals, endorsed her candidacy, making her even more of a favorite than she already was. Last week's Republican National Convention in Milwaukee came chock full of attacks on Harris, while Trump's speech accepting the nomination was written with no direct mentions of Biden.